Hello, students. I feel like we're starting to have a decent rhythm, or at least I feel that way on my end. If that's not the case for you, please do let me know. But we're turning today to a couple of Southern writers, and we're still in the modernist time period. So here is an image of William Faulkner, perhaps the most famous Southern writer, maybe of all time. There's a good chance you've heard of him before. He is a Nobel Prize winning writer of fiction, which is just about the highest honor one could receive. He didn't start out that way. His first two novels he actually referred to as foals, Foals, which is the name for a baby horse. And so he was sort of self-deprecating. He wasn't particularly proud of these in his later years. They were a way for him to get started. And we've seen that pattern fairly often. These modernists are not necessarily sprinting out of the blocks and achieving immediate success, except for Fitzgerald. These are some of his classic novels, and what really put Faulkner on the map and what continues to interest people about him is the style of his writing. He's famous for some really, really long sentences and also for writing fairly complicated novels that are sometimes stream of consciousness. Just whatever is in a character's mind is coming out on the page. And so he was making it new, if we remember Ezra Pound's famous directive. He's also writing what we've come to call Southern Gothic fiction. And what that means is that there's a fair amount of grotesque content. So I had to read As I Lay Dying in high school. And if you did as well, you might remember that there's a scene where a mother's body is sealed up in a wooden coffin, and a young man who really doesn't understand what it means for her to be dead decides that she can't breathe in there. And so he takes a hand drill and drills some holes in the lid of the coffin so that he can breathe, so that she can breathe. Unfortunately, he drills too far down, and the novel mentions that the drill bit chews up the face of the corpse of his mother. So scenes like that are kind of famous in William Faulkner's work. One could even say, I think, that we can trace The Walking Dead and some contemporary Southern Gothic content back to William Faulkner. There's also a fairly famous and infamous castration scene in the end of Light in August. This kind of shocking material really built Faulkner's reputation and built interest in his work. The other interesting thing that he did, or another interesting thing that he did, he set all of his fiction in the same fictional county, Yaknatapafwa. Please don't ask me to spell that. But he basically built an entire fictional world around a rural county in Mississippi. As I show you these other novels, I want you to notice that he's writing more than one novel each year. He's publishing more than one novel each year here. Then there's a large gap between 1932 and 1936, another large gap here. And the reason for that is Faulkner wasn't really commercially successful with his publications. He was better able to support himself as a screenwriter in Hollywood. We have entered the early era of films and movies becoming popular across the nation, and Faulkner could earn really good money writing scripts for movies. It frustrated him because he thought his most important work was his novels, but he needed the money. The last thing I'll mention is the Snopes trilogy, and I mention that because Abner and Sardi and the family in Barn Burning, their last name is Snopes. They are recurring characters throughout Faulkner's fiction. We're also reading a story by Richard Wright. We're reading The Man Who Was Almost a Man. As an African American writer, Richard Wright was thinking about earlier texts in his tradition. One of his early collections of short stories is titled Uncle Tom's Children. And you see there a direct shout out to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the basic gist of these stories, Richard Wright is trying to imagine what the descendants of Uncle Tom are dealing with in the first half of the 20th century. So he's deliberately signaling that he is thinking about what has changed in the last almost 100 years since emancipation. Famous novel that Richard Wright wrote was Native Son in 1940. The character in this novel, Bigger Thomas, is remarkable. It's kind of the first attempt at a real depiction of black anger. Bigger Thomas is not a happy person and shows it. And African Americans had not really been written about in that way or to that degree before Richard Wright publishes Native Son. So that's a landmark volume. Richard Wright also published a memoir, kind of an autobiographical story of his own life. The title was Black Boy. It was published in 1945. So you see that we're kind of easing out of the modernist era now. And thinking about it as occurring between the wars is somewhat helpful, but a figure like Richard Wright reminds us that there was no hard and fast date when modernism began or when it ended. So he continues to publish after the conclusion of World War II and really produces a large body of really great short stories, including 8 Men, published in 1961, which was the title for the full volume of the short story collection that contained the story that we read. So the title that he eventually gave it was The Man Who Was Almost a Man. A working title before that was Almost a Man. And so it's really interesting to ask yourself, I think, whether you feel that Dave in the story is a man or not, according to Richard Wright. Right? What did Richard Wright really think about Dave? He calls him the man, and he says the man who was almost a man. But the title of the full volume is 8 Men. So that's worth thinking about. Is Dave a man? Why or why not? Wanted to write about that story. You could think about masculinity, maybe find a song or a movie that tries to depict growing up and what it's like to grow up as an African American, as a boy, or something else altogether. Lots of options. I think that's all the content I wanted to share with you about Richard Wright and William Faulkner. I hope you enjoy these stories, especially since they're set, at least in our region, at least in the South. Gives them a little bit of a different feel, I think, than Fitzgerald's work. All right, hope everybody's doing well. Take care.